Welcome to the BTS Strategy Execution Podcast. Cracking the code, the secret to successful strategy execution and lessons for the C-suite. A leading strategy execution consulting firm, BTS recently partnered with the Economist Intelligence Unit to examine the key drivers of strategy execution and the high-impact leadership behaviors and actions key to an organization's success. Raman Adel, Executive Vice President at BTS, is here to take us through the research and key findings. During our discussion, Raman will expose the critical enablers of effective strategy execution, detail the leadership actions and behaviors that deliver the greatest impact, and explore key organizational challenges and disconnects that companies must overcome to achieve success. As the research will reveal, CEOs in particular should take notice of the findings. Raman, welcome to the BTS Strategy Execution Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Raman, to frame our conversation, would you describe the topic of the research and who was surveyed?
The latest research report that we just published really is the second in a series that we've conducted in partnership with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the focus is on strategy execution. Last year, we did a survey that looked at strategy execution and the skill gap in organizations when it came to business acumen. This year, we really wanted to dive more deeply into the key success factors and the secrets for driving strategy execution. We surveyed over 230 senior leaders across a number of different geographies, and we looked at companies that range from smaller companies to large Fortune 500 or Global 500 type corporations. In fact, approximately 60% of our survey body was from companies that were $1 billion or more in revenues.
Raman, for starters, what do you define as being strategy execution, particularly considering the human capital side of the equation? How did you define strategy execution in the context of the research?
Strategy execution is defined as a series of coordinated enterprise-wide decisions and actions that occur over time. And typically, it starts at the top of an organization, but to ultimately be effective, the strategy must be cascaded down through the entire organization, starting with the C-suite all the way down to the front line. And we actually have a framework that really defines effective strategy execution. And there's three key aspects. First, it starts with the CEO's strategic agenda, and that could be their strategies, the key performance indicators that they're trying to optimize. And then there's three key enablers of strategy. The first one is having alignment. So really having leaders in the organization understand the what's, the whys, the hows of the strategy. The second area is the mindset. So really ensuring that people in the organization have a belief in the direction that the company is going. They have a sense of urgency to get there, and they really want to go there as well because they believe that ultimately it will positively impact their employees, their customers, and their shareholders. And then finally, the third component is the capability. And in our world at BTS, there's really three key things that we think are essential. That is business acumen and decision-making, leadership and management skills, and then having the effective sales organization that can sell in a complex environment.
Well, as companies prioritize strategy development and execution initiatives, which is more important to their success? And how should organizations approach strategy formulation and implementation?
So there's been an age-old debate about what's more important. Is it the strategy or the execution of the strategy? And we actually tackled this question. It was one of the first things we looked at in our survey. And we found that 26% of the respondents or the companies that we looked at prioritized strategy formulation over execution. We found that 46% of those invested more heavily in implementing the strategy, and about 26% had a balance, and they focused almost equally on both. But the interesting thing about the findings is that companies that were revenue leaders, so these are companies that were the top growing companies in their industries, were most likely to strike a balance between strategy formulation and execution. And I think the interesting thing here is very often we find that companies implement the strategy. They typically have their executives go out and really push it out to the organization. So a lot of presentations, home meetings, PowerPoint presentations to get the strategy out there. And then about a year later, we get a knock on the door saying, hey, we need help getting people to really buy into it and go do it. And I think one of the key learnings from this is that if organizations can think and start planning execution earlier in the process, so even during the formulation process, they'll be much more effective in getting the strategy implemented quicker, as opposed to doing formulation and then almost independently then focusing on execution down the road. We also think it's important that companies use different ways to get the strategy out there, so not just presenting it, but using ways to really engage the organization and ensure that they're viscerally engaged with it and it really kind of hits them at their core.
Raman, you defined the key drivers of strategy execution earlier. Did the research findings support these drivers as critical to success?
So we looked at the three key drivers of execution: alignment, mindset, and capability. And not surprising, the market leaders, so the top performing companies in terms of revenue growth, profitability, and market share, all were really, really good at building alignment, mindset, and capability. And the companies that were laggards, the companies that weren't the high performers, the low performers in their industries, were not good at building alignment, mindset, and capability. So there was nothing overly exciting about that finding. We knew that intuitively. We knew that from our own research over the years. Now, the interesting thing that we then looked into was between alignment, mindset, and capability, which was the most impactful and the most important when it came to strategy execution. So which of those three levers was most important? Well, our research found that capability came in first. And the findings said that when managers are confident in their superior's ability to lead the strategy, the company had a 71% chance of being a revenue leader, a profitability leader, and a market share leader. The second one was mindset. So mindset came in at 57%, and then alignment was a 52% probability of success. The interesting thing about this is companies generally start exactly the opposite. They start with alignment first. So we've got our strategy, let's execute it, let's align the organization, so let's push it out there. And then hopefully over time we'll get people's minds in the game, and then over time we'll develop their capabilities. And what this research is saying is exactly the opposite. If we have people who have the right capabilities to lead the strategy, they have the right mindset, alignment will take care of itself.
Navigating now from strategy to results, what role do leaders play in enabling strong execution? And are there certain behaviors that are key to success?
Leadership is mission critical, and we looked at leadership. So based on the findings around alignment, mindset, and capability, we then dove more deeply into the capability piece. And first of all, we found out that companies that had invested in leadership, they had good leaders in the organization, were less constrained in their ability to execute the strategy. And companies that weren't as good performers were much more constrained by their leadership. And then we kind of looked more deeply into, well, what are the aspects of leadership that really determine a company's ability to execute? And first we found that by having very active leaders who are really focused on the strategy, they're very good at setting clear expectations around the strategy, setting goals around the strategy. Those were really critical, and those were characteristics of market-leading companies. Companies which were much more passive leaders, so leaders who were not good at translating strategy or setting goals and setting expectations and holding people accountable, those tended to be laggards. We also found that companies where the leaders were good at linking the overall company strategy to the business unit level or the functional level, those tended to be companies that were leaders as opposed to laggards. And then finally, when leaders in the organization made decisions that were consistent and aligned to the company goals, they tended to be leaders as well.
And now moving forward, What key challenges must be overcome today to execute strategy and deliver stronger business impact in the future?
So we looked at a number of possible impediments to strategy execution. And the one that really rose to the very top and was the most commonly cited barrier to execution was cross-organizational or cross-business unit or cross-functional, however you want to define it, collaboration. So collaboration was identified by 43% of the leaders who were surveyed as a critical barrier or challenge to effective strategy execution. And I do want to point out this was for larger companies, so companies with $1 billion or more, so complex, larger organizations really struggled with this. The next items, innovation and new product development, decision-making and evaluation of financial trade-offs, and then it kind of went down. Those were all in the 20% range and below. And this cross-organizational collaboration piece came out at 43% of the respondents identifying this as a critical challenge.
Raman, your discussion has revealed some of the complexities in making strategy a reality. Are organizations aligned around the challenges of strategy execution and leaders' abilities?
In our research, we found a significant disconnect between the CEO and board-level respondents and the rest of the organization in confidence in the abilities of the organization to execute. Interestingly, when we looked at the belief that we have the leadership capability to drive successful execution and belief that leaders in the organization exhibit those high-impact behaviors needed to execute strategy, we found that the CEOs and board members were significantly more confident in the ability of the organization versus the rest of the C-level leaders in the organization, as well as the non-C-level managers. So I think in part it's the CEO's role to be optimistic and confident in the organization's ability. But I think there's a bit of a disconnect in that they have a very rosy picture, but then as you get to the rest of the C-level leaders who actually have to make the strategy a reality, they tend to look at it not as favorably and probably point more to the barriers to execution than the CEOs do.
Raman, for those that are engaged in executing the strategy, what are some of the steps that they can take to improve effectiveness?
So to be more effective in executing strategy, I think the research really uncovers some key success factors. The first one is really ensuring that as companies formulate strategy, they really are thinking about the execution early in the process. So they're not looking at it as a linear or sequential process, but really there should be overlap, and one should really happen in conjunction with the other. And I think a lot of companies tend to wait too long to have the strategy all ironed out before they even start to getting to execution, especially as it pertains to the human capital side of the equation. The second key finding is making sure that there's alignment, mindset, and capability in the organization is a key success factor, and it's something that market leaders do really, really well. But I think it's important to take a holistic look at those three and really understand that you have to have the right capabilities in the organization. So you have to have the right people, and they need to have the right leadership and business leadership capabilities. And then they have to have the right mindset, and if you can do all of those two really well, alignment should take care of itself. And then as far as the specific leadership behaviors, it's important to have active leaders who are very hands-on in leading the strategy. They're great at tying business unit goals to the company strategy, and they make decisions that are aligned to the company strategy. And then one of the key challenges, which is an opportunity, is really to help build collaboration across an organization, whether it's across business units or across functions. And then finally, if we can do all of these really, really well, I think there's a really big opportunity to make it a lot easier for an organization to execute very quickly on their strategy.
Raman, I want to thank you not only for your time, but for sharing your insights on strategy execution and the actions organizations can take to enable success.
It was my pleasure. Great speaking with you.
Thank you for joining us. You can find more information about cracking the code and download the full research report at www.bts.com.